A husband and wife walk out onto a rooftop gallows in London just before 9 a.m. on November 13th, 1849. He can barely stand. She steps out in a black satin dress, face covered with a black veil, looking weirdly composed for somebody who is seconds away from being hanged in front of a massive crowd. Around 30,000 people are watching. Charles Dickens is there, Herman Melville is there, and the reason all these people are staring up at this couple like it's some kind of sick public show is because a few months earlier the two of them murdered Mary Manning's lover, buried him under the kitchen floor and tried to cash in on his money. And honestly, the more you go into this case, the uglier it gets. Because this is not just a murder story. It's greed, humiliation, fake promises, jealousy, bad decisions stacked on top of worse ones, and a love triangle that somehow kept going even after marriage, after affairs, after failed businesses, after lies, after everything. And what really gets me is how public all of it became. The murder was public, the manhunt was public, the trial was public, and then the execution turned into a full spectacle with people literally paying for a better view. That alone tells you what kind of case this was. This was a Bermondsey Horror. Mary Manning was born Marie de Rue in Lausanne, Switzerland around 1821. And right away there's something interesting here because even her early life picked up this fog of rumor later on. One of the stories attached to her says her parents wanted her in a convent. She rebelled, ran off with a bandit named Montano, and ended up living in an abandoned mansion in the Alps, like some deranged gothic side plot. But one of the sources I found makes it pretty clear that this was likely later sensationalism, the kind of thing writers added because the real story was already famous, and apparently that still was not dramatic enough for them. So I would not treat it as fact. What seems much more solid is this. Her parents died when she was young and she went to England to work in domestic service. First in Devon for Lady Anne Polk, later in London for Lady Blantyre at Stafford House, which was one of the grandest homes in the city. And this part matters because Mary was not born into luxury, but she lived close enough to it to feel it. She saw it, she handled it, she moved through those rooms, and once you've spent your days around silk, polished silver, titled people and houses where even the air feels expensive, I can absolutely imagine how hard it would be to go back to ordinary life. Some accounts describe her as charismatic, attractive, dark-featured, full of personality, the kind of woman who naturally drew attention. So now you have this young woman with ambition, charm, and a very clear taste for life above her station. That does not make her killer, obviously, but it does help explain why money keeps sitting at the center of this whole story like a lit match. At some point in the mid-1840s, Mary becomes involved with Patrick O'Connor, and even here the details wobble a bit depending on the account. One version says she met him on a boat crossing to France in 1846 while traveling with her employer. Another says they may already have been well acquainted and in an on and off relationship by then. Either way, Patrick O'Connor was in her life, and he was exactly the kind of man who would have caught her attention. He was Irish, around 50, much older than Marie, but wealthy. He worked with the London docks as a gauger, or customs man depending on the wording, and he had money from lending at heavy interest. Some accounts paid him as charming, some lean even harder into the idea that he was crooked. But the important part is that he had the one thing Mary clearly cared about securing by this point: money, real money. And while Patrick O'Connor is circling around her, there is another man too, Frederick Manning. English, closer to her age, working for a railway company as a guard and telling Mary that one day he is going to inherit a fortune from his mother. That claim turns out to be very important later because it sounds like one of the biggest lies in the entire case. Both men proposed to her. So just imagine the situation for a second. On one side, Patrick, older, richer, already established, but also significantly older. On the other side, Frederick, younger, easier to dominate by some accounts, and claiming his big financial future is basically around the corner. Mary chooses Frederick. They marry in 1847 at St. James' Church in Piccadilly, and almost immediately the dream starts collapsing. Frederick does not have the fortune she expected. He loses his railway job, apparently under suspicion of involvement in robberies, though not enough to charge him. So now Mary has tied herself to a man who does not seem to have delivered on the life she thought she was marrying into. That kind of disappointment is all over this case. You can feel it. It's in the money problems, the resentment, the affairs, the desperate scrambling for some better future that never really arrives. The couple tries to make a living. At one point they move to Taunton and buy the White Hart pub. That goes badly. Rumors swirl around both of them. Frederick is said to be seeing other women. Mary is still involved with Patrick O'Connor, or at the very least still seeing him on a regular basis. One source even says Patrick stayed with her there on several occasions. There's also this strange background thread involving two Great Western train robbers, Henry Poole and Edward Nightingale, men connected to the White Hart and to Frederick through friendship. The investigation did not find the Mannings involved, but newspapers still dragged Mary into the mess, even suggesting she may have informed on them out of revenge for Frederick's cheating. So by this point their life is already chaos. Marriage trouble, business trouble, money trouble, public suspicion, and still Patrick O'Connor remains in the picture. That is the part that feels so bizarre and so revealing at the same time. Mary marries Frederick, but Patrick does not really disappear. He keeps visiting, he dines with them. In some accounts, Frederick knows perfectly well that Mary is having an affair with him. And honestly, that arrangement sounds emotionally stable in the same way a chair with 3 broken legs sounds technically usable. Everybody in this triangle seems to know too much and tolerate too much until suddenly they don't. After Taunton, the Mannings end up back in London. They briefly run another pub called the King's John's Head, and that fails too. Eventually they settle at 3 Miniver Place in Bermondsey. They take in lodgers. Mary works as a seamstress in at least one account. Frederick is drinking heavily by now, and Patrick O'Connor is still around, still visiting, still close enough that some people know he goes there for dinner. That detail becomes fatal. By the summer of 1849, something hardens. Maybe Mary is fed up with her marriage. Maybe both of them are desperate. Maybe this is greed, plain and simple. Maybe it is greed mixed with humiliation and panic and that horrible feeling of realizing your life is not becoming what you thought it would be. I don't think that matters, because people do not suddenly become normal again once murder enters the plan. The emotional mess is already there. The Mannings decide to kill Patrick O'Connor and take what they can from him. They buy quicklime. They buy a shovel. A hole is prepared under the kitchen floor. And that is one of the most chilling details in the whole story for me, because it is so practical, so cold. They were not just fantasizing about getting rid of him. They were preparing the exact place where his body would go. The first attempt is set for August 8, 1849. Patrick is invited to dinner, but he shows up with a friend, Patrick Walsh, which ruins everything. So Mary invites him again the next night and specifically asks him to come alone. That detail is awful too. She has to make him feel wanted and safe one more time, so he walks right back into the house. On the evening of August 9th, Patrick O'Connor returns to 3 Miniver Place. And now the accounts line up on the essential part, even if they vary in the tiny mechanics. Mary gets him into the kitchen. She tells him to wash his hands before dinner. She maneuvers him toward the sink. He is standing there, turned away, vulnerable, and she shoots him in the back of the head. Except the shoot does not kill him. That part is so grim because it tells you how badly planned and how horribly real this became in 1 second. The revolver was too small or not loaded strongly enough, depending on the account. The bullet fractured his skull but did not finish him. He is still alive, groaning, writhing. And then Frederick steps in with an iron bar or crowbar and beats him to death. That is the moment where any illusion of one mastermind and one passive spouse starts to break down for me. Frederick later tried to blame Mary. He gave up a supposed confession saying she was behind it, that she had the grudge, that she shot O'Connor and then called him in. Maybe there is truth in parts of that. Maybe he was trying to save himself, probably both. But once he picks up that bar and finishes the killing, he is fully in it. Patrick O'Connor is dead. They strip the body, bury it under the kitchen floor, cover it with quicklime, replace the flagstones, and try to carry on. One of the accounts says they spent the rest of the night drinking whiskey together in near silence, unable to sleep. And the detail feels horrifyingly believable. What do you even say after that? The next day, Mary goes to O'Connor's lodgings on Greenwood Street near Mile End Road and starts taking what she can. Money, railway share certificates, valuables. She goes back again the following day to make sure nothing useful is left behind. So this was not panic after the fact. The theft was part of the plan. And then, because criminals who think them smarter than anyone almost always miss something embarrassingly basic, other people start asking where Patrick is. He had told people he was going to dine with Mary. He misses work. His cousin and colleagues get worried. William Flynn, in one account, begins pushing hard for answers. Friends go to Manning's house. Mary lies. Here the lie shifts a little depending on the source. In one telling, Mary says O'Connor had been there on the 8th with a friend, not on the 9th. In another, she admits going to his lodgings afterward and claims she was only checking on him because he wasn't well. This discrepancy actually tells you something useful. She is improvising. And improvised lies age badly. The more people ask questions, the worse it gets. Patrick's friends report him missing. A reward is offered for information. Police come to Miniver Place. At one point, Mary is still there and says Frederick is away, even at church in one account, and seems to think she can still steer this. She and Frederick panic. And now comes the part where they turn on each other without even having to say it out. Mary bolts first. She takes most of the stolen property and heads to Scotland. Frederick realizes he has basically been abandoned, sells off the furniture from the house, and flees separately to Jersey with whatever remains. That tells you a lot about this marriage right there. They were united enough to kill, not united enough to run. Meanwhile, police search the house again. One version says they first dug in the back garden and found nothing. Another says a police officer noticed a damp cornerstone in the kitchen floor with soft earth around it. Another says someone realized the flagstones had been scrubbed too clean and recently relaid. Whichever detail first gave it away, the result is the same. They pull up the kitchen stones. They dig. And about a foot down, they found Patrick O'Connor's body under the floor, shot, bludgeoned, covered in quicklime. At that point, the case explodes. The Metropolitan Police had only existed for about 2 decades, and this becomes one of those cases that suddenly feels modern. There's a search across distances. There's public reporting, there's technology, there's the telegraph. Police trace Mary to King's Cross, where she had taken a train north, reportedly first class, because apparently even on the run she still had standards. She reaches Edinburgh and stays in a good hotel under a false name. She also tries to cash or exchange some of O'Connor's stolen shares, which is such a reckless move it almost feels desperate more than clever. She is arrested there. One source also says she had left boxes at London Bridge Station containing blood-stained clothes and letters between her and Patrick, which is just one more example of how this whole plan keeps collapsing under the weight of its own sloppiness. Frederick takes longer, but not that much longer. He goes to Jersey intending, at least at first, to continue on to France. Instead, he starts drinking a lot. An acquaintance recognizes him during the journey and alerts police after reading about the murder. By August 30th, Frederick Manning is arrested too. And almost immediately he starts pointing at Marie. He says he is innocent. He says he only acted because of her. At another point, he says he killed O'Connor because he never liked him very much. Honestly, that line is so blunt it almost sounds stupid, except this whole case is full of people doing monstrous things for reasons that sound both petty and huge at the same time. The trial begins at the Old Bailey on October 25th and 26th, 1849, and it becomes a sensation, partly because the crime is already famous, partly because Mary is a woman, partly because she is foreign, partly because the press absolutely loves the image of a beautiful servant woman linked to aristocratic households who turns into a murderess in satin and silk and greed. There is even debate over whether the jury should include men of Swiss or French ancestry to be fair to Mary. That argument goes nowhere. One version says it was rejected because by marrying Frederick she had effectively become an English subject. The evidence against them is ugly and specific. The quicklime, the burial under the floor, the stolen shares, O'Connor's stockbroker identifying the certificates by their numbers and initials, the movements after the murder, the flight, the property in Mary's possession, and there are extra dark details too. A lawyer, a medical student, had apparently heard Frederick asking questions about chloroform and whether a drugged person could still sign a check. That doesn't prove everything on its own, but well, it does not help. The jury takes about 45 minutes. Both are found guilty. And Mary reacts in a way that made her even more infamous. She erupts. She says there is no justice for a foreign subject in that country. Other versions have her cursing the British as a treacherous or perfidious race. Frederick stays mostly silent. She also tries to reach for a royal pardon through old connections, but nothing comes of it. There is even one more account saying that on the morning of her execution she attempted suicide in prison and was stopped. So now the case is heading toward its last act. And weirdly, this is the part where the public almost seems more guilty than the killers, because the execution becomes this massive event, a rooftop hanging at Horsemonger Lane jail. The husband and wife are brought together shortly before the end. They speak, they kiss. Some sources say they had spent some time apart after the trial writing letters to each other, each begging the other to confess. By the final morning, there is at least some form of reconciliation. Frederick is terrified, he trembles, he collapses at the gallows. Mary is calmer, composed, concerned with her appearance, according to some reports. She wears black satin. She asks for a black veil to cover her face before she is let out, or a blindfold depending on the account. And then the two of them are hanged side by side. Frederick dies instantly. Mary struggles for a few seconds. And below them is this enormous crowd, loud and excited and vulgar enough that Charles Dickens is disgusted by what he sees. He writes to the Times that same day condemning the scene. And honestly, I get why. Because at this point, what are people even watching for? Justice or entertainment? One source says a woman died in the crash and 2 men were badly injured. Another says people paid for prime spots with better views. Herman Melville paid half a crown for a rooftop vantage point and later wrote in his diary about how strange it was to see a husband and wife hanged side by side after once standing together to be married. That image stayed with people. Everything about this case stayed with people. The street literature alone was insane. Broadsides about the crime sold in the millions. Mary's black satin dress supposedly helped to drive satin out of fashion for years, which sounds almost absurd, but honestly Victorian scandal had a very dramatic relationship with fabric. She ended up represented in wax. Her dead mask survived in museum collections. Her story echoes into fiction too, with Dickens later drawing on her case, and Wilkie Collins slipping a reference to the Manning couple into The Woman in White. And I think that is part of why this case still works on people now. It has almost too many layers. A woman from Switzerland chasing security and status in England. A husband who promised more than he had. A wealthy lover who stayed too close for too long. A marriage that seems rotten and dependent at the same time. A murder that was planned but not cleanly. A cover-up that lasted barely a week, a public that turned the whole thing into a theater, and then this final image of them together on the roof after all of it, still tied to each other more tightly by the murder than by the marriage. I also think it is fair to say the press shaped Mary into something larger and colder than life. The foreign woman, the calculating seductress, the satin-clad murderess. Some of that came from her own actions, absolutely. She helped plan the killing, she stole from the dead man, she ran. But the press also knew exactly what kind of female villain would sell papers, and they pushed that image hard. At the same time, I do not want to overcorrect so much that Frederick fades into the wallpaper, because he didn't. He helped kill Patrick O'Connor, he fled, he blamed Mary when it suited him. This was a shared crime even if the exact balance between manipulation, fear, greed and resentment inside that marriage is probably impossible to measure now. And maybe there is the thing that gets under my skin most. Not just that they murdered a man for money, it's how ordinary some of the motives feel before they turn monstrous. Wanting more, feeling cheated, trying to keep up appearances, believing one big move will fix everything, and then suddenly there's a body under your kitchen floor and the whole country knows your name. That it's such a brutal collapse. So, I'm curious what you think. Do you see Mary as the driving force here? Or do you think Frederick's later version was just a coward trying to dump the blame onto his wife once he knew he was finished? And do you think the public reaction says more about the killers or about Victorian society turning real death onto a crowd event? Let me know in the comments and tell me what case you want me to cover next. If you like this one, like the video, subscribe and stay with me for the next story.